Hello again, everybody. This is Robert Brighton, and welcome back to another edition of All That Glitters. And this edition is going to be the final installment in our four-part series-ish about the abduction and murder of young Marian Murphy in 1902 in Buffalo, New York. A hitherto, or previously, unsolved case. And in this installment, I'm going to reveal my solution to this case. Now, recognize that when I say solution, I'm not a judge, I'm not a jury. I'm not in any position to judge any person guilty. What I try to do, though, is I try to think like a district attorney. Could I bring a case against this person? Would I put my reputation behind the case I think I can put together for the person of interest in question? And I feel very confident about that. But I do want you to understand, I'm not saying that this person is guilty. I'm not saying that I know that for sure. I don't. I have simply built a case that if I were the DA, I'd take to a grand jury without hesitation. So let's get into it. First of all, there was a clue that stuck with me in my year of research into all the old newspaper accounts and lots of other documentation of this very famous unsolved murder. There was something that stuck with me, and that was this one comment that somebody made. And the person said that the cloth that Marian's body was wrapped in and the cord it was tied with looked very much like exactly like the kind of cloth and cord that paper hangers use. Now, in those days, all of these trades, and it's still true of trades, don't get me wrong, but all trades have things that are specific to their trade. And as it happened, if you were a paper hanger in those days, a wallpaperer, when you walked into a house, you didn't have nice sheetrock walls like you do here, which are perfectly flat and nice and straight. No. In those days, people had one of two things. They either had boards, like lath maybe, or even board and batten, or butted up boards. That was the wall of your room. Or they had plaster, which was troweled on over lath and horsehair and all that. Well, the problem with both of those things is, think about it. First of all, they're inherently slightly uneven. Even well done, they're slightly uneven. Plaster does crack. It expands and contracts with heat and cold, and so if you paint plaster and it cracks, and you've got nice paint and you've got cracks, and you can see it doesn't look good. And if you paint boards, they just look like painted boards. It doesn't look all that great. So paper hangers figured out that if they would take little tacks and tack up a sheet of very special heavy gauze over a plaster wall or over a wooden wall, sort of stretch it out like a painter's canvas over the wall, frame it with tacks, they could then hang the wallpaper directly on that canvas. Well, the canvas, even if the wall behind it isn't flat, the canvas is, because it's stretched, just like a painting in a frame. It's stretched. So they could hang the paper there. It also had the additional advantage of making paper easier to change, because you don't have to chip it off the wall or anything like that. You basically just peel the painter's canvas down, and the old paper comes with it. Anyway, so painter's canvas, or paper hanger's canvas, was very, very common. That was used by every paper hanger at the time. And I decided I wanted to see what this stuff looks like. Well, guess what? You can't find it, because it just isn't made anymore. There's no need for it. There's no call for it. Except, after probably 6 months of looking, I found one person who makes historic paper hangers equipment. Because there are people that have old homes and who want to restore them in exactly the way they would have been furnished, decorated, or whatever in their early days. And so there's one company that makes this paper hangers canvas, and guess what? They also make this stuff called paper hangers jute cord. So, I got some of it. This is a piece of paper hangers canvas that is almost exactly the size of what little Marian Murphy was wrapped in. And as you can see, it's like cheesecloth, but it's heavier than cheesecloth, and it's much stronger, much stronger. Cheesecloth kind of comes apart. You can almost put your finger through the weave. This is a sturdy, heavy, but very light fabric, so you can understand how something like this would have been very useful to a paper hanger. You tack it up, you stretch it out, it's not going to tear, and now you've got a perfectly flat surface. So this is paper hangers canvas, and this is what Marian Murphy's body was bundled up in. This is paper hangers twine. This is heavier than your normal jute twine that you might use to tie up a bundle of something, newspapers or something like that. This was heavier because it was used to tie up heavy bundles of wallpaper. Wallpaper's heavy. If you've ever picked up a roll of wallpaper, it's surprisingly heavy. And so they needed a heavier than average twine. And so every trade and profession comes up with what they like, and that's what everybody uses. So in those days, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of paper hangers, even in a good medium-sized city like Buffalo, and they would have all used this kind of twine cord, this kind of canvas. Now, that's interesting because it puts me in the mind of the criminal to some extent. But the question is, now I don't know who the criminal is, but who has access to paper hangers canvas and who has access to paper hangers jute? Paper hangers. Well, the cool thing is, I mean, the census records of those days recorded professions, and particularly, I was very lucky because the crime was in 1902. There's a 1900 federal census. Unfortunately, that doesn't tell me anything because what people were doing in 1900 isn't necessarily what they were doing in 1902, profession-wise or otherwise. So that doesn't help. But then I got lucky because I found that the state of New York does a census every 5 years, or between the 10-year federal census. So there was a 1905 census. Here's why this is important. After the crime, I noticed that Lloyd Horn, who'd shown up at the family residence the day after the disappearance, and then himself disappeared, seemed to be a very difficult guy to find. In fact, he left Buffalo for a while. And then he came back around 1904. It turns out in the interim, he'd done some time for a series of petty crimes and some violent, stuff. He was a champion wrestler, as I said, and he seemed to be a guy prone to, settle his difficulties with his fists. And so he had done some time in the Erie County Penitentiary, and he comes back to Buffalo late 1904, early 1905. Guess what? Just in time for the New York State Census. Well, I've been a little suspicious about old Lloyd Horn from the very start because I think his coming by the family home the morning after the murder was a little weird. I think the fact that his parents wouldn't say what he did for a living was kind of weird. I think the fact that he disappeared when the cops wanted to talk to him is pretty weird. But you know what? No one really ever mentioned Lloyd Horn because he was just a local guy, and people never thought that such a person would be capable of such a thing. But as it turns out, he had quite a record of petty crime and let's say petty violent crime. No murders, but certainly assaults and so forth. Bad enough to put him in jail. Anyway, he comes back in time for the New York State Census. So I dug that up and I looked up Lloyd Horn because he moved right back into his parents' house where he lived at the time of Marian's disappearance. And sure enough, there he was in the 1905 New York State Census. And thank heavens for the 1905 New York State Census because they recorded Lloyd Horn's profession, the profession that his parents would not reveal and that no one knew at the time, and now you do, because Lloyd Horn was a paper hanger. And so Lloyd Horn lived a block away from Marian. He volunteered the information that he had seen her on the night of her disappearance after her little friend had gone home. He said that he'd seen her weeping bitterly. He told the parents he knew where she had gone, and then the trail of Lloyd Horn goes cold until 1905. So, if I were the district attorney, I like Lloyd Horn for this murder. And I feel so confident about that I would bring that case to a grand jury. Now again, Would there be then or now enough evidence to convict Lloyd Horn? I don't know. And I believe that everyone is innocent until proven guilty. And yet, guilt only begins when a suspect is identified. And at the very least, I like to think that's what I'm doing as my part of doing something good for Marian Murphy. Nobody deserves an end like hers. And when I think of a little girl like that with her whole life ahead of her and what she must have suffered, it's very difficult for me not to try to do something about it. And this is my small contribution. So anyway, I hope that's been of interest to you. The Gilded Age, it was like our time in many ways. But one way it was not like our time is that a crime like this was truly unthinkable at the time. Today, I think we've seen enough of them over the years that parents are rightly cautious about letting their children, wander around the neighborhood, even their own neighborhood at night, because people do get abducted, and we live in a very highly mobile society where someone could throw your kid into a car and be hundreds of miles away by the time you noticed. So that's a big difference, though, from those days. And so I don't really blame the Murphys. They just did what parents did and let the little girl play in the street a little bit longer before Daddy came home. And unfortunately, that time, on that evening, in June of 1902, on a warm summer night, a perfect summer night, Marian Murphy met a monster. And I think that monster was Lloyd Horn. So, we'll be back again soon. I hope you've enjoyed our true crime investigation. And if you're in Forest Lawn Cemetery sometime, you can go to the lake or the pond where Marian's body was found. Spare a thought for her. Remember her. When people are remembered, they're never really dead. Thank you.